Okay, this is part 2 of the week 11 lecture, and I highly recommend you to watch the basal ganglia pathway video before moving on to this one, because I think it will definitely help you to understand the disorders of the basal ganglia and the implication of that. So this is continuing the hypokinetic disorder and the Parkinson's disease, where the substantia nigra is degenerated, and the effect on the lack of dopamine. So the two diagrams both shows reduced input of the dopaminergic neuron to the striatal neurons for both pathways. So it is represented by the dotted lines. And what you can imagine here is reduced dopamine production on the presynaptic terminal, the terminal bouton of this dopaminergic neuron. So reduced dopamine on both of the pathways. One thing you have to remember is for striatal neuron in the direct pathway, you can find D1 receptor, which is activating the or depolarizing the soma of this neuron. So the effect of less dopamine would be relatively hyperpolarizing effect. So this indicates lack of dopamine actually reduces the activity of the next neuron, because the D1 receptor, the role of the D1 receptor is when it receives the dopamine, it depolarizes. But because there's no dopamine available, or less dopamine available now, there will not be much depolarization happening in the striatal neuron. So if you decrease the activity of this neuron, you can imagine the axon terminal of this neuron will release less neurotransmitters. So you can indicate this decreased narrow of the less release of the neurotransmitters. But the activity of the next neuron is the opposite, because it was inhibitory neuron, so it was the inhibitory neurotransmitters, and now the inhibitory action of that neurotransmitter is less. So in other words, this neuron will be activated relatively more excited than usual, and as a result it will release more neurotransmitters. So I can indicate that arrow up to indicate those release of more neurotransmitters. And because this is inhibitory neurotransmitters, the neuron here will be depressed or inhibited by this large release of these neurotransmitters. So when this excitatory neuron gets depressed, the end result will be reduced neurotransmitters onto the motor cortex. And as a result of this excitatory neurotransmitters being reduced, motor cortex will be depressed. So the loss of dopamine, or loss of dopaminergic neuron in the substantia nigra, results in depressed motor cortex in the direct pathway. Let's have a look at the indirect pathway. So here again you see the decrease or reduced activity of the dopaminergic neuron, and you can imagine the release of less dopamine here as well. And this time the receptor on the soma of this striatal neuron in the indirect pathway are the D2 receptor, and D2 receptors, whenever it receives the dopamine, it's hyperpolarizing the soma. So it inhibits the activity of the neuron. But now the dopamine is reduced, this hyperpolarization will be reduced as well. So if you reduce the hyperpolarization, that means you actually increase the activity of the next neuron. So reduced of the dopamine results in increasing activity of this striatal neuron in the indirect pathway. And you can imagine the release of more neurotransmitters than usual, and these neurotransmitters, so let's say activity of this, results in decrease in activity of the next neuron, because that's the inhibitory neurotransmitters. So you get decrease in activity of this neuron, the globus pallidus external neuron. So you get less neurotransmitters released onto this straight subthalamic neuron. So then what happens is, because it's less, so let's say this is less neurotransmitters released, and the results of the next neuron, because it's inhibitory neurotransmitters, the next neuron activity gets up, so it's more depolarized or more excited than usual, and as a result it will release more neurotransmitters onto this globus pallidus internal neuron. And for this neurotransmitter that is excitatory, which means the arrow will be both the same direction, so release of more neurotransmitters will result in activity, more increased activity of that neuron, the globus pallidus internal neuron. And increase in activity of this neuron will result in more neurotransmitters being released onto the VL thalamus neuron. And because this, so let's say there's more neurotransmitters are released, and this neurotransmitters are inhibitory, which means this neuron gets depressed. And if the excitatory neuron gets depressed, it will release less neurotransmitters, excitatory transmitters, onto the motor cortex, and the result is depressed or inhibited motor cortex than usual. So if we zoom out, all the arrows, the end results of the reduced dopamine, the effect is both depressed motor cortex activities or inhibited motor cortex activities. So that's why Parkinson's disease patients exhibits the hypokinetic features such as bradykinesia or akinesia, representing the lack of activities in the motor cortex. So we can summarize the direct pathway was activated by dopamine, and the end results of the dopamine onto the direct pathway is activation of the motor cortex. Indirect pathway is so this is actually referring to the striatal neuron, so you have to be specific about this, otherwise you might get confused. So striatal neuron is activated by the dopamine due to D1 receptor, and for indirect pathway, striatal neuron, this is inhibited by the dopamine, and the end results of the dopamine on the indirect pathway is the same, activates the activation of motor cortex. So both activates the motor cortex, and reduced dopamine brings about the opposite effects, depressing the motor cortex. Now let's move on to hyperkinetic disorders, which is completely opposite of the hypokinetic disorders. There's some of the diseases in this hyperkinetic disorder category. One is called chorea, and chorea comes from the choreography, like dance-like motion. So it's characterized by random jerky movements of the limbs or facial structures. So that's presented by chorea. So they can't help control this movement. It's involuntary, excessive movements. Other types of hyperkinetic disorder is the ballismus or ballism, and it's characterized by proximal limb movements being flailing, showing flailing, and violently creating violent big movements. So ballismus or ballism, and usually happens in one side only, so it's usually called hemiballism. When the both agonist and antagonist contracts, one can also have dystonia. So both contracts, both of the antagonist and agonist muscle contracts, and causing the co-contraction of both muscles. So stiffening of the joint happens as a result of this dystonia. So creating the abnormal postures, abnormal neck postures or trunk postures, or limb postures can happen as a result of this dystonia. So we're going to look into details of the chorea and hemiballismus or hemiballism. And some of you might have already did this topic in your movement disorder seminar. And Huntington's chorea is the one of the example of this chorea movement, choreatic movement. So Huntington's disease is the genetic disorder caused by the defect in the chromosome 4, and this chromosome 4 defect causes the protein production called huntingtin, abnormal production of this protein than usual, and that actually destroys or degenerates the neurons in the striatal neurons in the indirect pathway. So let's have a look at what happens if we destroy the striatal neurons in the indirect pathway. So this Huntington's chorea is represented in this figure in the left side, and this shows the disruptions or degeneration of the striatal neuron in the indirect pathway. So this diagram shows the indirect pathway, and this shows the degeneration of this neuron by the protein called huntingtin. So we can start from this synapse. Now that the neurons are degenerated, there will be lack of neurotransmitter onto this neuron, which means so we can so this reduced neurotransmitter, which is inhibitory, means this neuron gets excited more than usual. So they will be activated, caused by reduced inhibitory neurotransmitters. And once you activate this neuron, you will increase the release of the inhibitory neurotransmitters onto this neuron, subthalamic neuron, and as a result, the subthalamic neuron will be depressed because it's inhibitory neurotransmitters. If you decrease the activity of the subthalamic neuron, you'll get less neurotransmitters onto this neuron. If you get less of the excitatory neurotransmitters, the next neuron will get deactivated or inhibited. And if you inhibit the inhibitory neuron, so let's say the neurotransmitter here is less, and that neurotransmitter is the inhibitory neurotransmitters, and if you reduce the inhibitory neurotransmitters, the next neuron gets excited. If you excite this neuron, what will happen as a result? You get more release of the neurotransmitters onto the motor cortex, which means the motor cortex will be hyper than normal. So this is increase in activity of the motor cortex created by the more release of this excitatory neurotransmitters onto the motor cortex. And thus the hypokinetic features appears in the Huntington's chorea or Huntington's disease. So this creating the hyperkinetic disorders. Let's have a look at hemiballismus or hemiballism. Hemiballism usually occurs in the stroke patients, usually who damages the subthalamus. So it's restricted to subthalamic hemorrhage or stroke. So subthalamic nucleus, if you damage the subthalamic nucleus, what can happen is cause of the flailing movement of the proximal limbs or involuntary movements of the writhing motion of the distal limbs, or irregular writhing motion of the distal limbs as a result. So this hemiballism is shown in the right side diagram, and you can see the damage to the subthalamus here. So let's say you have shortage of the blood to the subthalamus, and as a result this neuron will die, subthalamic neuron, and we can start from here. So if you have the less subthalamic neuron activating this, so this is less neurotransmitters onto this neuron, and this transmitter is the excitatory neurotransmitters from the subthalamus. So if you reduce the excitatory neurotransmitters, the result is depressed activity of the next neuron. And if you depress the activity of this neuron, the sinus occurs in the VL thalamus, you will see less neurotransmitters released. And for this neuron, because this neurotransmitter used to be the inhibitory neurotransmitters, this VL thalamic neuron will be activated than usual. More activated than usual means more neurotransmitters will be released onto the motor cortex, and that's also the hyperkinetic features, showing the hyperkinetic features due to increasing activity in the motor cortex. So you can see different parts of the basal ganglia has been shown for those two cases, but the end results are almost the same. It results in hyperactivity in the motor cortex. So both of the cases, as a result of the excitation of the motor cortex, it will induce hyperkinetic features. Okay, now let's move on to the learning part that occurs, motor learning that occurs in the basal ganglia circuit. Just to recap, last week we covered the cerebellar learning, and cerebellar learning was characterized by trial and error learning. So let's write here cerebellar learning is trial and error type learning, and the error signal was supplied by the climbing fibers. An example was the prism glass experiments, and you've probably seen this prism glasses in your tutorial class by now. So that's the cerebellar learning. So basal ganglia learning is very different from cerebellar learning, and it is a very important part of how we learn the motor task. And just straight to the point, the name for this basal ganglia learning is called reinforcement learning. So let's write this, reinforcement learning. And the reinforcement learning doesn't have error while learning the task, but what it involves is a reward signal. So reward signal acts as a training signal to find the right motion or movement for that problem. So in other words, rewards reinforces the behavior, correct behavior. And so the work done by reward signal is, in other words, the reinforce happens between the connections of the stimulus and response and response. So coming back for more is one other description of this reinforcement learning. So almost all of the animal training, like training a dog or training a cat or training a horse, all involves this reinforcement learning type, because the reward is given to the correct response, and that way animals are able to link the proper stimulus with the response through the reward signal. So you have to recognize this reward signal is not error signal. There's no way the animal will find, oh, I got it wrong, I have to do it better this time. Animal just follows, oh, I got more food, and I'll just keep doing this behavior, and that strengthens the stimulus and response of that behavior. And human also uses this type of learning for almost all types of habitual movements or well-learned movements. So let's have a look at the animal model of this reinforcement learning and how this is linked back to the basal ganglia circuit. So this is studied by Schultz and colleagues, and the monkey was trained to press a key with the setting. And the monkey, this is poor monkey, this didn't have any liquid during the weekend, so it's very thirsty. And so there's a trigger and there's a light. If the light appears in this button in this area, then the task is the monkey has to press this key. So there were medial and lateral keys. So whenever the parts lights up, so if say the lateral lights up, and the monkey has to press the key, and if the monkey got it right, there will be a tube delivering the apple juice to the mouth of the monkey. So just drop of apple juice if the monkey gets right. And what they did was they recorded the areas, the basal ganglia, and what they found was during learning, so the monkey could make errors or incorrect stimulus and response. So this lights up and monkey pressed this key, and the monkey will not get any apple juice. But when the apple juice, so when the monkey gets right and had the drop of apple juice, what scientists found was the midbrain area, especially the substantia area, was activated with the reward. When the monkey learned the task and monkey is able to just press the right key every time to get the apple juice, this is dopaminergic neuron in the midbrain, which is the substantia nigra neuron. It starts to respond to conditional stimulus, which is the light itself. So before the monkey gets the apple juice, whenever the light shows up here, the monkey's dopaminergic neuron was activated. So this actually shows that it starts to respond. So the dopaminergic neuron were able to learn or predict the reward. In other words, the dopaminergic neurons were able to associate the stimulus to the right response and predicting the reward that's going to be happen soon. So this can be represented in the diagram here. And the key function is this dopaminergic neuron that are activated by rewarding events. And when the prediction gets correct, so or better than predicted, it's activated more, causing more learning to occur. But if the prediction is wrong or just it's almost similar or bad, so remain uninfluenced or not good as predicted, it's depressed. So by activating and inhibition of these dopaminergic neurons, it is able to learn to respond to more rewarding actions. So if we put that into the basal ganglia circuit, so this is the basal ganglia circuit, let's label quickly. So this is caudate nucleus, that's putamen, globus pallidus external, globus pallidus internal. And the function of each basal ganglia parts are, so cerebral cortex tells the basal ganglia about the current state, representation, and putamen or striatum evaluates the current state. So evaluation occurs of the stimulus and motor state. And at the same time, it gets the signal from the substantia nigra to incorporate this is better than predicted or worse than predicted, and that integrated information goes to the globus pallidus to select the appropriate action. So this is where action selection occurs. And because of this integration of the substantia nigra, so I'll just write it here, substantia nigra sends the training signal for reward prediction. So this and evaluation gets integrated in the striatum, and as a result, the proper action gets selected that brings the most rewarding action. And this gets sent back to the motor cortex and goes to the upper motor neurons to execute that action. So this type of learning represents the all habitual motion that we perform in everyday life. So for example, toothbrush, brushing your teeth, tying your shoelaces, driving, if you're a skilled driver, so you go for more rewarding action or more correct action by using those loops over and over again, in incorporating the prediction signal, reward prediction signal from the dopamine. Not only the motor, this is related to motor skill, but because the basal ganglia have very intense connection with the entire cortex, cerebral cortex, it can also affect the thoughts as well. So for example, if someone suffers from OCD, like compulsive thoughts, this is also done by this circuit loop and involvement of the dopamine. And also the addiction to alcohol or like smoking, that also involves this exactly the same circuit, but involve different areas of the cerebral cortex. So any addictive addiction or habitual actions, this is done by this reinforcement type of learning, happened by the dopamine and the basal ganglia. So let's finish up by comparing the cellular learning, which is represented by this diagram here. So reinforcement learning involved the rewarding signal, but cellular learning involved the error signal. And because error implies there's a comparison between the target and the output, and that's forming a training signal, it's also known as supervised learning. So error signal works as a teacher to tell the system, oh, you done it wrong, do it this time. So encouraging the movement to reach near the target. But for reinforcement learning, there's no target. There's only reward signal that just increases strength between the correct stimulus and response of that particular situation that brings the most reward. So this is very different learning type, but we need both of the learning format to perform the motor skill, learn the motor skill. And next week, we're going to also learn the last type of learning done by association cortex. So I'll just finish at this point for part 2 lecture.